Staging a Roman funeral often meant backlash and ruin. It involved parading wax images through volatile crowds and delivering risky eulogies, while rivals counted every extravagance. Nevertheless, senators and equestrians repeatedly took on this daunting challenge. They even competed against each other for the privilege because, contrary to popular belief, everyone wanted to outshine rivals at the bier. In this video, we ask why Romans were willing to risk ruin to turn death into status. Picture this: 15 March 44 BC, the Ides of March, and the heart of Rome is filling for a funeral that will rewrite the city's politics. Primary sources record it plainly. Plutarch and Suetonius describe Mark Antony's eulogy, the corpse laid on the rostra, and a crowd that turned from mourning to fury. Archaeological evidence confirms the setting: the rostra and via sacra cut a narrow, enclosed route through the forum, a stage made for spectacle and for sudden violence. A Roman elite funeral, the pompa and the funis, was logistical theater. The cortege could include magistrates flanked by 12 lictors, hired mourners, actors wearing ancestral images, musicians, and freedmen bearing torches. Processions flowed along streets only a few meters wide. Excavations of the forum and adjacent streets show stone pavements hemmed by dense multi-story timber buildings. That tight topography multiplied danger. Pyres in the urban core were especially hazardous. Cremation required vast tinder oil, resin, pitch, and timber. A single torch could send embers into thatched roofs and wooden scaffolding. Contemporary accounts describe smoke that scoured the eyes and soot that blackened statues. Archaeological layers in the central forum preserve ash and burning debris consistent with public conflagrations, proof that these were not imagined risks but lived realities. Crowds made every funeral a public gamble. Tens of thousands could press into the forum and surrounding streets. Plebs surged forward to gape, to grieve, to be seen. Freedmen and clients jostled for place beside senators. Ancient witnesses record how Antony's words lit the crowd. Men who had come to watch a pyre left with torches and rage. Funerals were in effect mobile rallies whose routes could be redirected into riots. Costs underwrote the danger. An elite pompa required huge outlay: lavish pyres, gilded beer, paid actors impersonating ancestors, and feasts for the attendants. Such expense signaled rank. A senator's funeral differed from a libertus by the scale of display and by who walked in the procession, but it also created incentives for spectacle. Wealth bought visibility. Visibility could be weaponized. Different social orders experienced the same event in different ways. Senators watched from the curia and the rostra, calculating political fallout. Plebeians crowded the street, vulnerable to crush and smoke, but eager for the drama that promised redistribution of honor. Freedmen, often organizers of their patrons' display, could turn a funeral into a platform for client networks to assert themselves. That is the case at Caesar's cremation. The forum's geography amplified Antony's words and the pyre's flame. Funeral ropes, torches, and the narrow via sacra converted grief into mob action. What began as a funerary rite ended in arson, street violence, and the seizure of power by men who knew how to stage mourning as politics. Historical records show funerals did more than honor the dead. Archaeological evidence confirms they endangered the living. Ancient sources reveal how routes, pyres, crowds, and cost intertwined to make elite funerals a volatile display of status and power. In Rome, mourning was never private. It was the most dangerous kind of public performance. Picture this: Rome, the forum rostra heaped with flowers. March 1544 BCE. Suetonius records the city stunned after Julius Caesar fell, struck some 23 times by knives in the theater of Pompey. Suetonius says the body was carried to the rostra in the forum and laid out for the people to see. Mark Antony ascended the rostra. Suetonius records he displayed Caesar's bloodied cloak and pointed out each wound to the crowd. Suetonius reports Antony then read Caesar's testament, allowed the dictator had bequeathed 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen and left his private gardens to the public. The reading of that will Suetonius writes transformed sorrow into fury. According to Suetonius, the urban plebs, the crowd that filled the forum, were moved to tears, and then to violent anger they clamored for revenge, and for the punishment of the assassins. Suetonius describes the sound shouting weeping the sudden roar of a populace turned toward wrath. Senators were at the heart of the crime. Suetonius makes plain that many of the conspirators were men of the Senate. But Suetonius records that, as the mob surged, the conspirators found themselves isolated. Several had to flee Rome. Suetonius notes that equites, men of the equestrian order and property holders present in the city, watched the events with alarm and divided loyalties. Suetonius gives a vivid scene. The funeral pyre was raised on the rostra itself, the forum's central platform becoming a place of cremation and spectacle. Suetonius writes that when the pyre was lit, the flames leapt, the smell of burning wax, wood, and cloth filled the forum. Suetonius records that heat and flame consumed not just the pyre, but set nearby structures alight as the crowd surged around the fire. Suetonius emphasizes how social ranks reacted differently. The plebs pressed close to the spectacle, weeping and shouting senators, and some equites pulled back alarmed and then fleeing. Suetonius records that the crowd, inflamed by Antony's words and moved by the will, tore down images and attacked the houses of suspected conspirators. Suetonius makes clear the immediate political consequence. What began as a private funeral became a public uprising. Suetonius reports that Antony's manipulation of public sentiment compelled the Senate and the leading orders to reckon with a plebs suddenly armed with grief and memory. Suetonius shows the funeral as a demonstration of where real power now lay, not simply in senatorial decree, but in the capacity of one man to sway the forum's masses. Suetonius concludes that the episode forced senators into flight and political retreat, and that the violence which followed grew from that single explosive day. Suetonius therefore presents Caesar's funeral as a moment when status, senator, eques, or plebeian, was exposed as conditional before spectacle and testament. Suetonius' account leaves us with a clean causal thread, a reading of a will, a staged display of wounds, a pyre on the rostra, and the Republic's fragile political balances overturned by a crowd's fury. Picture Rome in 450 BC. The 12 tables are inscribed and set public rules for death as well as life. The law code, 12 bronze tablets, laid down who could claim public honors, who paid for rights, and who was excluded from civic burial. Historical records show the 12 tables as the legal foundation for funerary rites. Ancient sources reveal two tiers of public recognition: the private funeral and the funus publicum, the state-backed funeral. A funus publicum, or triumphal display, could only be granted by magistrates or the Senate, and signaled civic esteem as much as personal loss. Livy warned that such displays were political currency, noting that funerary eulogies often inflated a family's record to claim honors. Archaeological evidence confirms the spectacle. Excavations in Rome and Pompeii have uncovered funeral masks, ancestral imageries, and space in atria for public display of wax portraits. Inscriptions from the 1st century BC through the 2nd century AD record official funerary grants and list processional privileges: who rode in front, who carried torches, who was entitled to a public eulogy. But the law and ceremony did different things for patricians, plebs, and slaves. Patrician families used imageries and elaborate processions to display lineage across generations. These were legalized status markers under the 12 tables and later customs. Patrician funerals could cost thousands of sesterces, employ dozens of attendants, and culminate in a public laudatio that reinforced political networks. Plebeians found other roots. Collegia, burial clubs recorded in numerous inscriptions from Ostia and Rome, kept bylaws specifying dues, burial rites, and the order of procession. Archaeological tombs in the epigraphic record show collegia statutes from the late Republic onward detailing monthly contributions and the right to collective tombs. These bylaws were community insurance for a small monthly payment. A plebeian could ensure a proper burial and a place on a shared monument. For slaves, legal disability mattered. Primary sources and funerary inscriptions indicate slaves were often excluded from civic honors and depended on their master, the familia or collegia set up by freedmen. Excavations of columbaria and communal graves reveal tightly packed niches marked with simple inscriptions. Names, ages, membership of a guild, registering lives otherwise invisible in literary narratives. Ancient law and practice also regulated excess. Multiple historians document later sumptuary constraints and municipal ordinances limiting costs musicians or torch-bearers to curb competitive ostentation. Inscriptions and court records attest to fines and civic penalties when families violated these norms. Contemporary accounts, Livy's critique of eulogy's epigraphical bylaws from burial clubs and the growing archaeological corpus, converge funerals were legal acts and political theater. They encoded rank, mobilized networks, and redistributed honor. The consequence was intimate and structural. A funeral was not merely mourning, it was testament. For a patrician, it secured memory and office. For a plebeian club, membership could guarantee dignity in death. For a slave, it exposed legal marginality. Excavations and inscriptions confirm that how you died and who paid defined how you were remembered. Ultimately, funerary institutions, 12 tables, statutes, state funerals, and collegia bylaws, made social order tangible at the moment of loss. The rites of death revealed Rome's power hierarchies as plainly as any law or census. Picture this: a bier on the Via Sacra, wax masks glinting, a funeral cortege winding past the forum, and an epitaph hammered into stone for posterity. Ancient sources reveal funerals were more than mourning, they were public claims to honor and rank. Archaeological evidence confirms that these displays were material and strategic imageries. Stone inscriptions and family tombs made lineage visible to all of Rome. On the tomb of the Scipios, archaic epitaphs record L. Cornelius Scipio Barbatus and advertise careers dating to the early 3rd century BC. Scipio Africanus returned from victory at Zama in 202 BC, with triumphs that his family's funerary displays amplified for a generation. The tomb itself is a monument to political memory in stone, existing as a social archive in the heart of the city. Excavations and inscriptions confirm that these displays were chosen, arranged, and defended as public statements. The Esquiline necropolis holds Eurysaces the baker's tomb, dated to c. 3020 BC, its reliefs advertising kneading and milling, and naming him as a pistor. Such imagery signals wealth earned outside aristocratic birth and makes a social ascent legible to passers-by. Primary sources agree status could be bought or engraved. Freedmen like Eurysaces used funerary architecture to turn commercial success into social memory. The Laudatio Turi, an unusually long funerary eulogy preserved in stone, reads like a private letter made public detailing inheritance, disputes a wife's loyalty during exile and her management of family property. Inscriptions of this kind demonstrate how testimony in stone could shape claims and reputations long after a death. Historical voices sharpen the point. Livy warned that funerary praises could invent offices and triumphs. Cicero likewise complained that eulogies exaggerated achievements. Together they frame a ritual arena where memory and political capital were forged in public view. Families acted accordingly. Patrician gentes commissioned elaborate tombs and kept lists of offices to cement aristocratic privilege. Freedmen invested in conspicuous monuments and epitaphs that converted wealth into respectability. Women, often omitted from public office roles, shaped legacy through private texts like the Laudatio and through control of dowries and funerary rites. Excavations have uncovered the textures of these moments' imageries, and stone plaques facing the street charred incense on altars, and the carved faces of ancestors watching from the tombs. These sensory traces confirm what inscriptions claim. funerals operated as legal and social instruments. The consequences reached far beyond grief. A public ritual could rehabilitate a disgraced career anchor, a family's claim to land, or sustain an aristocratic narrative for posterity. It could also expose falsity. Historians like Livy and Cicero remind us that memorials could lie. At the bier, Romans negotiated memory, power, and law. Funerary speech in stone turned personal loss into public currency. Memoria was not sentiment, it was politics. Ultimately, Roman funerals taught a simple value in a society governed by honor: to be remembered correctly was to remain powerful. Memoria translated into social mobility, legal leverage, and political legitimacy across Rome, Ostia, and the provinces. Transition from the monuments of memory in Rome to the spiraling energy of siege and honor on the battlefield. The next section explores how visual fame and public praise extended into military achievement, where the Corona Murales and the first-on-the-wall drama became yet another arena for Roman virtue, rank, and reward. Picture this: a city street clogged with a slow-moving cortege, torchlit by dawn and echoing with lament. A line of wax-imagined ancestors stares from gilded poles. Lictors clear the way as a crowd shifts between grief and display. The funeral becomes a stage where mourning is repurposed as crisis of memory and claim to public legitimacy. Historical records confirm that Roman funerals were structured by a vocabulary of value, virtus dignitas, gloria, memoria, pietas, and those words guided every gesture. Tacitus records how the laudatio funebris could function as a political resume delivered to the crowd, shaping influence in the forum and senate. Livy repeatedly notes the danger of inflated claims that outpace fact, turning public mourning into political theater. Suetonius notes how imperial and senatorial elites harnessed funerals to cement power and loyalty. Archaeological evidence and inscriptions confirm the material side. Excavations around the Forum, along the Via Appia, and in provincial necropolis reveal family tombs, carved imagenes, and monumental sarcophagi that broadcast lineage. Epigraphic finds, inscriptions on stelae, altars, and tomb panels show how families displayed their memoria in stone. Primary sources agree the visible past was a resource to be displayed and litigated in public. Virtus shaped the content of praise. Laurels and military exploits were rehearsed in speeches, poetry, and epitaphs. Tacitus notes that generals and politicians framed courage and service as the currency of masculine honor. Suetonius records how emperors linked virtus to political legitimacy in life and after death. In practice, a centurion or legatus could be celebrated for deeds on campaign, with the Corona Murales serving as a near-currency symbol of valor. Dignitas regulated comportment. The right clothes, gestures, and offices signaled a life worthy of remembrance. The symbolic public gestures, proper attire, measured steps, solemn orations, were designed to project an ideal citizen. Aulus Gellius explains the Corona Murales as a monument of rank and virtue, often shared within the unit in moments of collective triumph. The arrangement of funerary gear in tombs and chapels testified to status and function. Gloria and memoria were performance goals. The elite aimed for permanent public memory, inscriptions, monuments, and the repetition of a laudatio across generations. Livy and Cicero lampoon the excesses of funerary rhetoric even as they record them. Epigraphic studies show how families use stone and word to create durable fame. The Arch of Augustus and other commemorative structures testify to how memory could be spatialized across the city. Pietas knitted the private to the public. Philosophers argued pietas bound the living to the dead through ritual duties. Funerary rites, libations, offerings, the ongoing maintenance of tombs, were civic acts as much as family obligations. Contemporary accounts describe incense, the clatter of mourners, footwear, and hired lamenters, a sensory social performance that legitimized political claims through shared ritual. But not everyone could convert death into power. Elites monopolized largesse professional orators' imagines and massed processions. Commoners relied on collegia and communal burial grounds inscriptions, and burial clubs attest to collective mechanisms for securing decent interment and memoria. Archaeological surveys show a clear difference in scale between monumental aristocratic tombs and modest grave markers of the urban poor. Multiple historians document how these funerary practices served as political technology monument and eulogy, could manufacture reputations, cement alliances, and signal succession within social hierarchies. Tacitus Livy and Cassius Dio corroborate the dynamic, while epigraphic surveys and debris across Ostia Capua and Rome reveal the broader social reach of funerary power. The private loss became public capital. The consequence was long-term funerary display fed imperial ambitions and later religious transformations. As the Republic's rhetorical economy shifted, virtus dignitas and pietas survived, but were reinterpreted by new rulers and new religions into different languages of remembrance. In short, a Roman funeral revealed more than mourning, it revealed who could claim the city's memory and why. Transition next, we turn to how these performances of memory intersected with imperial ideology and state religion, tracing the arc from Republican display to Christian memory and beyond. Picture this: in Rome, funeral rites began as intimate family mourning, but quickly grew into public theater that signaled who ruled. Archaeological evidence shows that elite burial places near the city became increasingly monumental as authority centralized with inscriptions naming patrons who funded public funerals. The shift travels from the Republic into the Empire, where the dead become a pageant of rank and allegiance. Primary sources anchor the chain in spectacle and authority. Tacitus and Suetonius describe emperors and key nobles staging lavish funerals to legitimize succession and to remind the living who commands the stage of power. Aulus Gellius offers a striking account of the corona muralis, the mural crown, presented to the first man over the city wall in war, a symbol that blends martial glory with political standing. Archaeology corroborates these patterns: monumental sarcophagi and richly appointed necropolis along major routes, plus inscriptions praising patrons who financed conspicuous burials. Historical records and material remains together show funerals as instruments of authority, not private sorrow alone. The experience of funerals split along social lines. Patrician families built and funded conspicuous mausolea that announced lineage to distant audiences in Rome and across the provinces. Plebeian and later equestrian elites could sponsor public funerals to access elite networks and political favors. Freedmen often carved a social niche by funding or sponsoring tombs that connected their descendants to powerful patrons. Slaves, by contrast, received more modest burials, and their consumption of public ritual rarely translated into real social leverage. These divergent practices reveal a cleft in the social contract: ritual display as ladder for some, coercive obligation for others. Concrete dates and numbers ground the drama. The Republic's late era already treats funeral processions as political currency, a dynamic sharpened after Julius Caesar's public funeral in 44 BCE, an event Suetonius and Tacitus note as profoundly political. By 27 BCE, when Octavian becomes Augustus, state-sponsored funerals intensify as a tool of imperial legitimacy. Across the early emperor's grants of honorific status and public commemorations proliferate, visible in inscriptions and in the spatial logic of mausolea along Rome's arteries and in distant provinces from Gaul to Hispania. In coinage and public art, the denarius and sestertius often carried portraits aligned with dynastic messaging, reinforcing the link between mourning and policy. Geographically, Rome's capital and its orbit, the Ostian port, the provinces of Gaul and Hispania, and the cities of the Italian countryside show how ritual practice travels and adapts. In Rome, elite ritual dominates central display, and the province's local elites emulate the model to compete with urban centers. Across this map, the same logic persists. Funerals become a currency for social ascent, political protection, and legal privilege, while ordinary mourners face a starkly different set of expectations and consequences. The human face of this arc is clear. A noble family can weave memory, patronage, and access into a single ceremony. A provincial magistrate can leverage a public funeral to redraw local allegiance. A freedman can translate gratitude into a durable public marker of status. In every case, the dead speak as power, and the living learn where their place lies. From Rome's streets to its distant corners, the pattern of funeral display as political order endures. Modern state funerals and curated gravesites echo this ancient logic, while questions of who is remembered and who is silenced remain disturbingly familiar. In the next section, we turn to how medieval Europe repurposed these legacies to forge new forms of sovereignty and memory.